Hey folks, welcome to my first Swapcast. I was invited on Marie's podcast a few months back, and as you will hear right now, the conversation got really intense, really deep. It was one of those rare instances where we connected instantly on extremely intimate, deep, intense issues, but in a very, very positive manner, which resulted in almost like mutual epiphanies, and both of us coming out of this conversation feeling extremely replenished and awake to a lot of issues that we were dealing with, and just feeling like really, really, really good about the conversation. So Marie's version was released a couple of months back, so when I approached her for the Swapcast, she was game, and the results of the same are to be heard right now. Marie is an author and an entrepreneur, and I'm going to include the links on the episode notes, which you should definitely go check out. She has a book out. This episode is quite in alignment with a very specific phase I'm going through with my artistic and entrepreneurial journey. Namely, it's getting increasingly personal and up close. I've been removing layers from events in my life, exposing myself more out there, feeling confident in doing the same, and using the lessons I've learned through the exposure to serve and help the people I work with, my collaborators, my clients, students. So this episode felt like a very appropriate one to share in light of this phase I'm going through. I hope you will feel similarly when you listen to it. Here's me reminding you again that these are independent ventures, so if you want to support us, please go subscribe to us on a podcast platform of your choice. If you're feeling particularly generous, give us reviews, and also check out the links of my guest, check out the links of the sponsors of this show, which is yours truly, and generally speaking, keep coming back, hear us out. That's pretty much the only reason we do it. Alright, without much further ado, please welcome Marie Suazo.
Hello fellow beings, welcome to Tapasya Loading, a safe space to attempt honest, raw and authentic conversation in homage to the ancient act of stoking a sacred fire. This episode is brought to you by the Holistic Musician Academy, your home for 360-degree music mentorship, music, self-care and artist development.
Hi Marie, thanks for having me on.
No problem. So for our audience, could you just tell us a little bit more about yourself? So what kind of third culture kid are you? The different countries that you've traveled, lived?
What kind of third culture kid am I? Well, I spent my formative years growing up in a combination of 4 countries, which are Libya, the UK, well actually London only, Germany, and India. It's interesting you ask me what kind of third culture kid I am. It used to be, quote unquote, exotic enough to be a TCK in the first place. And of late, I've noticed there are subcategories to the same.
Yes, there are. So it's become a wide range of like definitions. Some people think that they're third culture kid, but they're actually a cross-cultural kid. Not to put any like labels or anything, but usually when I ask that question, people just say, oh, the diplomatic background or military background or, you know, the reason why they had to move around.
There is a considerable degree of mythology surrounding it, I have noticed. But with your permission, I'd like to share what I have come to settle on as my definition of a third culture kid.
Sure, go ahead.
I've been listening to a couple of episodes of your show as well, and I noticed that discussion happening. It was interesting. There were a few points where I wasn't really sure I was on the same page as well with regards to the definition. A TCK definition for me is pretty simple. If you spend your formative years in a culture outside that of your parents, of the generation earlier, you end up being what is referred to as a third culture kid. The culture of your earlier generation, the culture of their environment, and the culture of the environment you're in kind of end up being the 3 that define one which you're making on your own, right?
Yeah, I totally agree.
I've had people who were essentially expats wonder if they weren't TCKs. I'm not sure I agreed with them. I've had people who consider their teens as formative years. So I do have a background in psychology as well. And formative years are strictly the first 9 years of our life, 6 to 9 maximum, which is when the personality traits of our brain are kind of developing themselves. And I realize a lot of this is open to debate, and rightfully so.
But I came across the term TCK and resonated with it as deeply as I did, because I noticed that my mindset was something that really, really is not something that could be pinned down to any one of the cultures I had been spending my time in. There was no way I could figure out a manner in which I could identify as one single of those. At times I feel like whatever it is I am as a cultural being is a combination of all of these, but even that is not as black and white, I think. At this point, I'd say I'm just cherry picking the aspects of each culture which I find are in alignment to my views in life and building a culture that works for me. Some people tend to find that extremely privileged and find that unfair. I've been accused of being entitled and privileged as well. But my response to that would be that there's struggles that an upbringing like this come up with leaves one with no other choice but to do exactly that, to focus on the positives each of these cultures give you, and try and build on those positives and build a persona, build a mindset that really works for your own well-being, because anything else results in severe cultural schizophrenia, which is not a fun space to be in.
Yeah. And it's so interesting that you said cherry picking these different cultures. And I find it so fascinating because as my audience knows, I grew up in Korea for most of my formative years. And I find every time I go back to Korea, I just find the beauty and the positivity. And I just love being back in Korea. And I have a friend who's Korean, but she grew up in Poland. And every single time I talk about how beautiful like Korea is, she's like, what are you talking about? Like she can't see that, because it's her home country, like in quotation marks. And it's funny because I feel the same way about the Philippines. Like when I hear other friends who grew up here, who grew up with like kind of like that privileged lifestyle, I'm like, I don't see what you see,
Yep. I hear you. I want to ask you a little more about your background in a bit, if I may.
Yeah, go for it.
But that's another terminology, by the way, before we move on to that. The whole idea of a home country, that doesn't exist for me. I don't have what is referred to as a home country. I am of South Asian descent, but what makes it even more complex in my case is my parents themselves were immigrants. They were refugees, and they became Indian citizens, but they weren't born in what is referred to India anymore. And I recently did a DNA test, and turns out most of my DNA is like from a whole different part of the world, which is Myanmar and Burma and Nepal.
Oh, wow.
So that's a whole different kind of worms or rabbit hole, whatever, which makes me all the more possessive about my TCK culture in a way. On some days it'll feel like the only thing I have.
Well,
may I ask you a little more about your background?
Sure. So yeah, I was born in the Philippines. So to Filipino parents, they worked for the government. So embassy kid, diplomat kid. We moved to Korea when I was 2, and I stayed there until I was 11. So most of my formative years were definitely in Korea. And then we moved to the Philippines for 3 years, and then Egypt for 5 years or 6 years. And then I went to college back in Korea, and grad school. But at that point, my parents moved to Oman as well as Canada. And so when I would go on vacation during either Christmas or like Christmas break or summer breaks while I was in college or grad school, I would go visit them in Canada or Oman. So that is my third culture kid upbringing, all in.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
May I ask you how you feel that's impacted your mindset in the long run?
Definitely. I think because I lived in Korea for most of my life, like more than half of my age, I would stand very Korean. And because I went to international schools my whole life, I feel I'm very Korean American, if you want to put it into certain terms. And so it's definitely affected the way that I interact with other Filipinos, because I don't always understand people of my, in quote, my culture. And so we don't usually think the same way or have similar mindsets or brain waves. And I remember I was working for a company that had Korean values. And I remember my Korean self kind of was being triggered, and not the most healthiest way either. So I think that's another aspect in where, because I grew up in Korea, there's a lot of negative things that came up. Like just say like Korean hierarchy culture when it comes to work. And I'm sure that's not the only East Asian culture that has that. I'm sure other cultures have like the hierarchy. And so even though it was here in the Philippines, even though I was working with other Filipinos, like because it was a Korean company and I still had Korean bosses, there were moments where like my anxiety would just get triggered because it's like, I'm in a Korean company. I need to act a certain way and I have a certain belief systems, and not all of my coworkers understood that. And that was fine because like they were really nice, but like even people who I wouldn't necessarily call friends, like coworkers, they didn't understand where I was coming from. And it was really hard for me to connect with them. So just in that way, I think being a third culture kid made me feel like different and othered. What about for you?
Yeah, quite similar in a lot of ways. I can intimately relate to the sense of anxiety being triggered in workspaces, especially because, like you, I'm going to take the liberty of presuming. In recent years, I've been working in South Asia as well, and especially here in India, which is where I am currently to visit my mum. Work culture can be very hierarchical too. And I'm very European in my work ethic, Central European, which is a pretty emancipated, non-hierarchical work culture, at least aims to be anyway. It's not as black and white, but aims to be.
Oh, yeah.
And even though a lot of my schooling is British, which again has its own hierarchies, but my mindset when it comes to work is absolutely Central European. I've spent my entire adult life in Central Europe and Germany. But here in India, I'm just a brown dude with an Indian name.
Well,
and to kind of really draw those boundaries and make it very clear that, hey, there are a bunch of cultural idiosyncrasies I'm not going to participate in. That can be draining. Over the years, I've kind of almost worked on a system. It's not foolproof, but worked on a system where I know, okay, this is going to be a thing. So I'm just going to set aside an account of energy and time, which I know will be spent in making this fact of it very clear. And for the record, it paid off, just being that awareness of what's going on. Because in the beginning, I wouldn't know what's going on. I'd be on tour with some of my friends, with musicians. It was so common to be on tour with some of my colleagues who were white, and I wouldn't understand why did they just get treated differently than I did? Even though we were at the same venue, we were working on the same locations. And when you're younger, this was in my 20s, it doesn't bother you as much. You're just so, caught up in the high of travel and working, and you're out to just establish yourself in your field. But with time, it started taking a toll on my psyche and needed a good deal of inner work to kind of process and find solutions to, because I came to a point where I noticed that I have two very clear choices. I can either just code switch to my South Asian version, which was never really me. It was a learned language, a learned avatar. So I can fit in and just kind of go with the flow. But I noticed that backfired very quickly because it took a toll on my work, like the actual work that I was involved in. The authenticity of it was being severely compromised. So I quickly learned that this is not an option. I can't do it. I'm in the arts, I'm a musician, so I can't go, present a work of art that I've been working on in a very specific environment for extended periods of time and just pretend to be someone else 5 minutes earlier. It just doesn't work.
So interesting. I wanted to ask you, because my experience for my 20s was actually kind of opposite. So because I think a lot of influence came from being Korean, or growing up in a Korean environment where I would overthink. And also coming from a diplomatic background where I'm like constantly on overdrive, just thinking about what are people thinking about me?
Yeah.
When we would go to diplomatic parties when I was really young, my parents taught me how to, act a certain way or be a certain way. And I think it's only now that I'm recognizing that I was basically conditioned to be a people pleaser. And so I was wondering for you, because like for me, my 20s were just spent like trying to people please. And I'm finally entering a time in my life where I'm like, I'm tired of this. Like, let's do things that I love to do, without making excuses for anyone else. Not saying like so-and-so, but so-and-so needs me or they need me to do this and all that. And then one day I remember thinking like, I don't need to do anything for anyone. I need to live for myself. And so I wanted to know what it was like for you. So you said like, cause yours was the opposite of like, you were just establishing your, career when you were in your 20s. At what point did you realize, you said it was affecting your psyche? Like was there a point in time in where you're like, I can't do this anymore? That you started taking steps towards healing?
Yes, thank you for sharing that, by the way. In fact, I think our experiences have quite a few parallels. I completely relate to that epiphany when you know that, hey, I don't need to do anything for anyone, at the cost of being someone I'm not. I would add to that with the thought that you can't really do anything for someone at the cost of being someone you're not. That didn't come out right. But, there's this whole oxygen mask analogy, your own oxygen mask first and then others.
Right.
The whole concept of serving others at the cost of your own well-being is a paradigm that's been prevalent for way too long. It's a kind of situation people like us tend to find us in. Actually, not just us. Anyone would tend to find themselves in very easily. It kind of creeps up on you before you know it. And next thing you know, you're either code switching or doing the chameleon thing or people pleasing. And at the end of the day, eventually, you don't really serve the people you were supposed to. And you've ended up being mean to yourself as well. To answer your question, I'm sorry, I tend to be a little complex with my answers.
No worries.
Here's the thing. I'd started off my musical career very early at 17. And those were the last few years I spent in India. I lived in India for about 11 years. And most of it was very tough. I never settled in. Music was my savior, quote unquote, for lack of a better term. And this is where I started my music career as well. So I started off working with a lot of well-established, very well-respected Indian musicians here before I moved back to Europe eventually at 20 to pursue formal studies in music and pretty much built the bulk of my career over the next 10 years in Europe. And then around 2007-9, there was this huge arts music renaissance in India happening, thanks to the internet and the open economy. And this huge independent music and art scene started growing here. People from all over the world were talking about it. And I started touring here, working here in India as well for a bit. I say here, I keep saying here because actually I'm in India right now. I might have mentioned. And during this time, I would also collaborate with some of the musicians I'd worked with earlier on and current artists who had met later on. And I started noticing a pretty large disparity between the dynamic between the two parties. Like the people who knew me when I was 17 would struggle or refuse to acknowledge, and now it's been 20 years since almost, I'd see that disparity even more clearly. That started escalating until about 3 or 4 years later. Some of the musicians I worked with were downright rude to unethical, to be absolutely honest, in the manner with in which they would go about the whole dynamic. I mean, I'm putting myself out there by saying this, and I don't think it's something they necessarily did on purpose, but the difference is I'd literally been touring all over the world in these past 20 years. They'd been in the same country, mostly same town.
Yeah.
I guess what it really boils down to is being seen. I'd constantly deal with accusations of being privileged and entitled thrown at me. Meanwhile, the struggles I'd gone through in the past 20 years trying to establish myself as a musician of color in a very white-centric society, but not just bypass, but no one had the ability to even understand what that brand of struggle is. Because Central Europe is extraordinarily white-centric society. You know, racism was a very fragile term to even address even 3 years back. And I've worked like deep into the system. I used to work for the German government. I was tenured as a music teacher for them. So I knew how those mechanics were. So it was just very frustrating, to be absolutely honest, to be an advocate for people of color, for equality, for cultural integration, and then have accusations of being privileged and entitled being hurled at me when I was in my ancestral country, trying to contribute to an ecosystem that could benefit with output from people with a broader outlook. Does that make sense? That was a long...
It does. It really does. It feels like you're almost like sandwiched in between these two cultures. You're not exactly like completely privileged, but you're not privileged. If you stayed in that one country, you're almost like sandwiched in between these two like systems. And if you haven't experienced one or the other, it's really hard to understand where that person is coming from. And I think that's an issue that I consistently face on a daily basis here in the Philippines. And it's very interesting because I'm thankful I've gotten to know so many amazing people who actually do like want to know about my background and whatnot. But there's also a group of people who don't really care or don't, you know, like what they would say small things like, I remember at another workplace I worked at, they would be like, it's so hard to get to know you. Just speak Tagalog. And I'm like, excuse me, you know? Or they're like, it's really hard to hang out with you. Like, why don't you adjust? And I was because I was new to the Philippines then. And so when she said that, I remember like breaking into a million pieces because it's like, I almost wanted to shake her and be like, what? Constantly has to adjust. Like, what are you doing? You know? And so that's what I was thinking. That was like the inner monologue Marie that was really angry and upset at what she said because for her whole life, that this was it. You know, there's nothing outside of that. And I realized just the years of like living, there's two things that happen when I interact with anyone, just by being my third culture self. And I'm sure some of our other third culture kid listeners might, you know, relate to this, and where there's two things that happen. One, someone adores you for having grown up elsewhere and they want to experience that. And they're so proud to know a friend like you. And then there's the other where it's like, no, don't even like, I don't even want to get to know you because they're so jealous of the way that, and they refuse to get to know me. So those are the two kinds of people that I've noticed just by being myself, and where they either really care about me. And then I think that adds another layer because it's like before, if I were to have never left, I think there would be different reasons I would come up with where someone likes me or not. And I would come to the conclusion where there's just people that are not going to like me. They're just people that are going to like me. But like to add the layer of culture, it's really tough. And just to tie into what you were saying before about your psyche, I think having to constantly be doing that thinking, having to be like, okay, was this culturally acceptable? Was this okay to say to them? You know, like, I feel like my brain is on overdrive and I don't think it should be doing that, as a human being, just to cater to another person.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Personally, I find it hurtful, to be honest, to tell someone you're so difficult to hang out with. That's a very judgy thing to say. I mean, who's to say they're not the one who's difficult to hang out with? I mean, who gets to say that? I mean, that is such a waste of time, that conversation to, I mean, I guess in a way it's almost a boundary conversation. Why does someone think they have the right to overstep and make a random comment like that? And it does shed light on a challenge which is kind of global. How do people with lesser exposure and people with more exposure engage.
Well,
How do we go about that? I realize that there is a need for compromise and understanding, but isn't that understanding supposed to be mutual? And I know it's a thought experiment, and I know that as people who have had, for lack of a better term, the privilege of being exposed to multiple locations, multiple cultures in their formative years, you do have an advantage of actually having an inherently broader lens, not just a conceptual one, but an experiential one. And yes, that is, I hesitate to use the word privilege because the other side of the equation is all the baggage that gives you too. That lens didn't come without its price. And that's the aspect to it which most people just refuse to acknowledge. For every bit of privilege my background has given me is a suitcase full of trauma that is equally heavy and needs equal amount of work for me to process.
Definitely.
And it's just, I don't want to say, I don't even want to say it's unfair, but it's just a lot to handle sometimes, that this airplane of baggage just goes completely unacknowledged and unseen by most people. It's a bit of a dilemma. I'm not really sure. I'd be lying if I said I know how exactly to deal with that at times. I guess the good thing is the world is increasingly globalized in this day and age. The India I came back to as a kid in the mid or late 80s, and the India today is very different. I remember when my parents moved to India, I'd still have, my family spread all over the world. When my cousins would visit from Europe and UK or the US, I'd be like, oh, what's the latest on the new series? And, do you get any comics for me? And it was like overnight, my life disappeared. That wouldn't happen today. I've lost all my friends as a kid. I lost my best friend, Paul, at a school in London. I never saw that guy again. The amount of times my heart's been broken with all the friends I've lost, that probably wouldn't happen today. Or I wouldn't have to wonder what's going on my favorite series. I could just switch Netflix on and stuff. So the point I'm trying to make with this is hopefully the internet will flatten that curve to a degree where communication between TCKs and non-TCKs, not to make this a whole us and them thing, but will improve. That is my hope. But I've noticed even that there's only so much a screen can really teach you.
Yeah. And, I just want to add on to that, where I remember when I would come on vacation, when I was really young, this is back in the 90s, I would come to the Philippines for vacation for holidays. And my cousins would be like, they would just tell me to go back to Korea. They'd be like, Korean, go home. And it's so funny because now everyone wants to talk to me about Korean culture because K-dramas, K-pop is very global. And so I just found it so interesting that the very thing that you criticized me for when we were kids is the very thing that you want to ask me about now. I feel like there's this weird acceptance for me coming back to the Philippines. It's almost like I'm coming back as a superstar now because they're like, oh, she's our, access to Korean culture. She can tell us if we ever go travel to Korea, we can bring her along. It was a completely different shift in the way that people looked at me. I just had that Meyer epiphany right now as we're talking about it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Question for you, if I may.
Sure.
What do you identify as? Would you identify as Korean, or do you identify as Filipino, or neither?
Third culture kid. To be honest, like I said, I think I feel definitely Korean American. If I were to put myself in a box, because I don't think completely Korean, but I don't think completely American or Westernized either. And I definitely don't think like a Filipino. It just, the logic just makes no sense to me sometimes. And, when I would watch certain things on Filipino TV, I don't understand why people would react that way to certain scenes. For me, it would be a conversation. Cause I don't know, maybe it's similar to telenovelas, right? It's why would they act that way? It's all for the entertainment. But to answer your question, I definitely feel like you said earlier, a cherry picking. I feel like I'm a mix of all these things that I'm a part of. And I'm sure there's certain parts of me that, that I've adopted with each Egyptian culture that I don't even know about. And it only comes out when I'm with certain friends. And I think that was so funny because earlier today I was talking to a Korean friend and, I kid you not, like my Korean self came out. So I don't know if you're familiar with like Korean dramas, but like sometimes the trope of the girl, like her high pitched voice wanting to be with like, an oppa, which is like this older brother figure, and her voice raises like an anime character. And so she and I, just like that Korean side of me was coming at us.
That's my best friend in Berlin used to be Korean. Unfortunately, she recently moved back to Korea. So I just realized I'm a terrible friend because I don't really know much about Korean culture at all. But may I ask you, when you say like the logic doesn't make sense to you, could you give me an example?
Sure. For example, there is this not to offend Filipinos listening, just disclaimer right there. But one thing I've noticed in Filipino culture is that they will, like, if they don't have the means for something, they will still throw a really big party, just to show their neighbors that they want to celebrate their child, but there's like no means for it. And so for me, it's like, it makes no sense. Like, then don't invite people, then don't have a party, just have a cake. Like, cause for me, I'm not a big, like, I like birthdays, but I really like it when I grab a dinner with people that I care about and then call it a day. And like, like they give me specific gifts that I've been wanting. Like that's it. That's a birthday to me. But like more often than not, I see like these Filipinos, not only are they throwing a party for their kid, those kids' families are invited and those families' friends are invited. So it always feels weird to me when like we throw a party, like let's say we have a relative's party and then random people who no one knows just come just to eat. And so it makes no sense to me, like the logic, first of all, the logic on the fact that you will spend so much money just to please these people. And then on the other end, it's like, you don't know anyone at this party. Why are you coming? Like, why are you eating free food kind of thing? But then from my understanding, it's a community thing where it's like, oh no, but like, we know them. We want to take care of them. It's just like that, like, I don't know. Maybe you have insight on this.
No, I think I hear you. So
I have a free gift for you, my friend. No strings attached, legit free gift. What if you could have your entire career as an independent musician presented to you on one page? All of the aspects you needed to be aware of, starting from creativity to collaboration, stuff most musicians are a little less privy to, like PR, other aspects of music business, down to self-care, and a very lucid display of how all of these elements are interlinked. What if you could have one page which gave you an overview on all of that? I can give you that page, and it's up for a completely free download. Please go check the episode notes. You'll find a link there. One page, an entire overview of an independent musician's career. And in case you're wondering why I'm doing this, I want to build an ecosystem of holistic, happy musicians and artists who are building their careers in a fulfilling manner on their own terms. So, if this is something that resonates with you, go download the Artist Roadmap. Yo, TL, I'm driving. Where do I find this thing? Just go to the holisticmusicianacademy.com. It's the first thing you'll see.
Is it too flashy for your taste?
A little bit, and flashy for my taste, and also because it's just like, why won't you save up for college? Like, why won't you save up for like these things? And now as I'm externally processing, because I'm an external processor, maybe that was their, like gift to their child. Like maybe that was their one, like, because they hardly ever have parties. And so I try not to generalize. So I'm having this epiphany as I'm like talking as well.
Yeah. Well, good that we talked about that. Do you remember the first time you noticed that you weren't the same as other Filipinos?
This is a very interesting question. I don't think I've ever been asked that. I think I've known from a very young age. I think the first time was when we came here to the Philippines. So my mom was pregnant with my brother, and so we came here because she wanted to give birth here in the Philippines. And I was with my cousins, and they couldn't understand because I was speaking English. that was it. Like, and I remember my mom was like, why don't you call your cousins over? It's time for dinner. And we were in a province, like their province, and we were visiting like extended family. And I remember I went out and I like called them over and they just looked at me like, and I think that was like the biggest, I was just like, prior to that, I went to international schools. Everyone understood everyone. Everyone spoke English. And if I was outside of my school, I spoke Korean. So at that point in my life, no one hasn't understood me. So I think going to the Philippines at that young of an age and then not being understood, because my mom was like, where's your cousins? I was like, I called them. And then my mom had to go call them. And my cousins told her, they're like, we don't understand what she's saying. Was there a moment for you where you noticed that you were different?
Yeah, didn't take a lot of time. I had a very strong British accent when my parents moved to India. It's my accent's destroyed now. I don't even know what accent it is. It's like my own mix. But when my parents moved to India, I came straight out of elementary school in London, so it was very British. And the first day at school, and also my father had this thing about putting me in a local school and not an international one. So even though I got through to the international school here in Calcutta, he wanted me to go to a more Indian school to have a more authentic Indian experience. Full disclosure, my father and me had a very complex relationship as well, because there was a lot of friction between the two as well. I think one of my biggest struggles was it did feel like he did encourage a certain kind of quote unquote South Asian culture being shoved down my throat without asking for my permission. Oh. And I also did feel at sometimes that I was embarrassing my parents by not fitting in. My parents were first generation post-colonial proud Indian citizens. And all of a sudden, the dichotomy of their kids speaking with a British accent after having, and also my dad struggled in the UK. He faced a lot of racism. And so UK was a bit of a mess back in the day. If you were colored in the 80s in London, life wasn't the way it is today. It was very, very different. So it must have been quite difficult for him to subconsciously process his son sounding like the people he was facing a lot of discrimination from. That's one of the major reasons he moved to India. He said, my son's getting too British. So the whole move back to India was sketched with a little bit of that sense of unease anyways. It was like he was really trying to Indianize me in a way. So my first day in school was me standing in the middle of the classroom and people just laughing at my accent. Like, what is up with this guy? There was no learning curve involved. It was bang in the middle, in the thick of it. Again, it was a very different era. I hear kids today in metropolitans in India, they have very varied accents. But back in the day, it was very easy to stick out, especially not to get too historical, but the city my parents chose to live in, which is Calcutta, was the ex-capital in India, and it was the capital during the British reign. So this city especially is a little harsh on accents that sound British, because they were a big part of the freedom movement for India's independence. I was ashamed of my accent. Like the first, I literally had to learn to change and learn the Indian way of speaking English just as a survival tactic. It was either that or being constantly bullied.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that. Like, I'm sure that comes with a lot, and to be able to freely share that.
That's just the tip of the iceberg, I'm afraid.
Like the story of us all. Yeah. Basic level one, but
pretty much.
I just wanted to say thank you for sharing that, because I think
you're most welcome.
Even as a third culture kid, I'm sure people listening also hasn't verbalized their story in that way yet. Because even as you were talking, there's certain parts of my story that I was like, oh my gosh, I don't think I've ever said that out loud. I don't think I've ever, like when you were talking about you were ashamed of your accent, like I don't necessarily feel like I felt ashamed of my accent in the Philippines, but I felt ashamed that I guess like my parents, like I didn't know what to be for them. And that struggle of, I'm ashamed that I couldn't be what they wanted. And I don't think that they would have expected me to turn out this way either, because they've never raised third culture kids. They wanted to pursue the career to be sent out on, diplomatic missions. And so I'm sure they had no grid for what that looks like, because, back in the 80s, right? It's not as prevalent as resources as we do have now. I have a follow-up question. Knowing that now, how does that change the way that you do your daily life when you're interacting with other people?
Thank you. That's actually a really, really interesting question. I had to reclaim my true persona. I had to really reclaim my brand of communication, my brand of showing up in society, regardless of the location I was in. And it was tougher than I'd counted on. Thankfully, my work, my music was such that it left me with no choice. Like I told you, like the disparity between me on stage and me off stage was getting so hard to handle. So music has been my guide in a way, to a point where I was left with the choice wherein I could either fake it on stage, and I'm not a very theatrical artistic persona. My music, my work is a very intimate and personal reflection of my life. And it was getting to a point where it was very apparent that there were a lot of situations in my life off stage where I was not being authentic. I had to change that. There would be repercussions. And it also showed me that a lot of my so-called friends weren't really my friends, because the people who I thought were friends didn't really see me. Not only did they not see me, they were the kind of people who insisted that they were entitled to giving me directions on how I ought to be behaving. So it was a very thorough reclamation process I had to go through that removed a lot of clutter from my life. Was also painful. That ended up in a lot of broken relationships. It felt like a veil being removed, and me finally it was almost like being, I won't say reborn, but being just really finally finding a connection with myself. I think the biggest realization I came across was I was compromising the connection with my own self in order to connect with others, and that is a complete fallacy. That just never works.
When you talk about, like this veil has been lifted, could you give us an example of what that looks like for you? I know you mentioned a couple of things here and there, but I'm wondering, because I'm trying to see. So for me, I'll just give a quick example. I'm going through this process in where I also do feel like it almost feels like the friends that expected me to be a certain way, they were just cutting ties with me because I was not who they expected me to be. And also having that distance between certain people in my life, I realized I have a choice to remove them. And there's this level of peace that I feel just being able to not consider what they.
Absolutely. I want to be careful with the word remove, because I think the removement happens on its own. I think the point to focus on is really ask ourselves, who are we? How do we want to show up in society? And those of us who don't accept us in that avatar, in our true form in society, in our true avatar, they'll be removed by default. It's not something that needs any action on our part per se. I think the important point to focus on is to really show up authentically in society without compromising on how we want to go about that.
Yeah. I just want to add on to that. Sorry.
No apologies needed. Go ahead.
And I do agree that the removing will happen on its own, but I think it's really important to also make sure that your boundaries aren't crossed.
Absolutely.
Because I think I've experienced both, in where certain people just came out of the woodwork saying like, hey, I don't like what's been happening with you. I don't like the way that you've been treating or changing and all that stuff. And although there is an aspect of me that I have to ask, like, what did I do in this situation? How did I contribute to this? But eventually, like, you need to, like, there comes a point where you need to let it go. Like, and also, like, on the other side, making sure people don't cross your boundaries. Like if they act a certain way, making it very clear to them. Of course, not doing it like, not ghosting them. I don't think that's very healthy, but actually having a genuine conversation saying like, hey, when you do this, it actually makes me feel this way. And my boundaries were crossed. Like, I hope you can honor that. But if they continue to do that again, no matter how many times we've explained it to them, there needs to be a conversation in where you say, hey, actually, I'm sorry, but I need to move on from this because it's not healthy for me.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think everyone will have their own individual approaches to go about the entire process.
Right.
Because it can be confusing, where do we start? It's always that first step when you know that major changes are about to happen. That first step is what defines the rest of the process. And in my case, it's always about making sure I show up authentically. The rest of it, the boundaries, the conversations, they will follow on their own, but they're not going to be very helpful if I'm not really at peace with the manner in which I am showing up first. And to rest my case, when I made that decision that I am going to reclaim my identity, I did that not to try and influence the environment around me as much. It was more about making a call to make sure my environment doesn't define me anymore. Because as third culture kids, you're not stuck in one environment. You're constantly in multiple environments, psychologically or geographically, either way. So what was my location independent persona? Who was I really independent of location? That was my first step. How do I want to show up authentically, regardless of where I am? Without blending in, without playing chameleon, without code switching. And the rest just kind of happened on their own. The friends who accepted me for who I am, they just accepted me for who I am. The ones who didn't, their conversations, their attempts to pass judgment on the changes happening were so lame and just so irrelevant that there was just no space for a conversation in a lot of ways. And then there were others where I thought our connection was worth a little more effort. And those still didn't work out, unfortunately. And that's where the letting go had to take place. That's where I had to work on the letting go. I just repeated myself. So yes, all of these aspects you just referred to, very, very relevant. But I do think the order in which we go about the entire process can make a world of difference.
Can you emphasize? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, you asked me for an example earlier on, right? I can think of a specific example of a friend who was really, really close to me. He was like a brother. And it was apparent that, especially because we spent some of our earliest musical journeys together, and music is it's a very sacred space. You grow up with your with musical colleagues. If you spend your formative years working on your musical skills together, your musical education together, it's a very special bond. And when I left for Europe to study, I did everything I could in my power to kind of include him in my journey to the best of my abilities. It wasn't easy. It wasn't such an internet savvy era. And I noticed that there was a gap, and there was, it wasn't easy for him to relate to the changes I was going through. And I would also notice how the disparity between our rate of growth in our careers, in our artistic journeys, or even the nature of our growth were very, very different. And we were close enough for me to have like serious conversations about this. And at some point it was, I actually tried to work with him, wherein I tried to help him out in a bit of a sticky situation he'd found himself in, and ended up being accused of being controlling and privileged and entitled and not being capable of understanding the situation people can be in because of my overtly privileged lens and control issues. And it was a long and painful process, and a very, what's the word I'm looking for? very conclusive experience to these decisions I had to make in the past, that there's only so much that is healthy to do in order to maintain connections. You know, you can't maintain connection at the cost of the connection you have to keep with your own self.
Right.
There have been issues with, I don't know what dating is like for you as a TCK, but that's another whole can of worms.
Yeah. I had a whole series of that last year on the podcast.
I should listen to that. I mean, a lot of issues will flare up then too, where it's very apparent that it's not very easy to I say this in the same vein because, you know, for me, friendships and dating, they're not really that far apart in a lot of things in the matter, because, you know, a breakup with a friend is actually as painful, if not more in some cases. So at the end of the day, I guess it's really about taking responsibility for, I know I'm sounding like a broken record here, but taking responsibility for the manner in which we show up in our environment and just owning it and making peace with the consequences that comes with. Does that make sense?
It does, because like even the word taking responsibility, or because the role that we played in the relationship, I think even that in and of itself, like we can dive deep into even what that looks like, because I think that looks very different for every person. Because I could take responsibility for what I did for one person, but it doesn't necessarily make, I can't use the same formula with another friendship.
Just to be clear, when I was referring to, just to make sure you didn't misunderstand me, I think the responsibility I was referring to is the responsibility for uncompromisingly showing up in the manner I want. Yeah.
Oh yeah, okay. I mean, like in that way too.
Not so much. I don't think I'm responsible for the manner in which people react to that. That's on them.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's where we have to weigh what's important to us. Right.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because I feel like for me this season, in the crossroads that I'm going through, I feel like there's a lot of weeding that's happening in my life. Mm-hmm. Like, what does this season look like for me? Like, what career path do I want to take next? You know, not necessarily more on friendships, because I feel like at this point in my life, I've already established the friendships that I have. I've known them for like 14 years and plus. And it, you know, like we were all laughing, say that we've known each other for too long. This is ride or die because we know too much at this point. And I'm thankful that I have friendships like that, but also just, I feel like I've done the foundational processing that I have as a third culture kid, and where certain things don't affect me as much as they used to. Like a comment, like someone would say like, it's hard to befriend you because A, B, C, and D. I would just brush it off now because I've been able to process those things. And so now where I feel like there's like clear-headedness in a way, like you were talking about earlier, like this veil has just been lifted off. And now I'm like, I get to call the shots now. No one's going to ask me to move anywhere or be anything that I don't want to be, or, you know, condition me to be a people pleaser. Like I get to call the shots now. Mm-hmm. And what kind of shots am I calling? What do I choose? Like what kind of friendships do I want to show up for? Do I want to continue showing up for certain friendships? Do I want them to continue showing up? You know, just like a lot of questions being asked. And I think that's definitely one challenging aspect as a third culture kid, because I feel like it's just constantly conversations that are happening in our minds that we can't always verbalize, that we don't always have the words for it until you have a conversation with someone and it's like, oh, they finally put the vocabulary to what I've been feeling or thinking. Does that make sense? I feel like I went on a rant.
No, not at all. This is where the whole phenomena of cultural schizophrenia also plays a major role, because I think for a lot of monocultural people, it is not possible to realize that when we're asked difficult questions, we're answering multiple personalities. That almost sounds like an MPT, but like there are multiple cultural personas within us that need to be at peace with the reply we come up with. You find yourself in a certain situation, subconsciously, we are asking ourselves, okay, what would the Filipino in me think of this? What would the American in me think of this? What would the German in me think of this? What would the, Egyptian. I mean, it's not just one cultural context we're dissecting that entire situation from.
Well,
that is a heavy load to bear and not very easy for monocultural people to relate to, and which is not their fault, needless to say. But I think we as TCKs deserve a little more credit wherever that comes from, even if that credit is just coming from our own selves, for the quantity of work that demands. It doesn't get talked about enough.
Well, I really like the way that you put that. To acknowledge TCKs, the quantity of the work that needs to be put in, or that goes into just being ourselves. Like, it's a lot.
It's a lot.
Like, and I remember like thinking that, cause I was talking to a couple of friends a few weeks ago, and I was saying like, what I've gone through is a lot. And I was just telling them it was a lot. And then one friend commented saying like, what you've gone through, like the word enough, like the word a lot doesn't even begin to define what you went through. And so when she said that, it broke something in me, in a sense where it's like, I no longer feel like I have to hold on to this, like this baggage where I was like, I have to like make myself look perfect and whatnot. Like when she said that, like I felt like I could be human. And someone was seeing me in this aspect of my existence in this way for the first time. So I think that's so beautiful. And for anyone listening, it's true. There is a lot of work that needs to go into being a third culture kid, and applaud yourself for making it this far.
Yeah, we are not privileged tourists who went on vacation for the fun of it, you know. That's another aspect people don't, that's actually a very important aspect that doesn't get talked about enough. TCKs moved around without having a say in the matter. Nobody asked us if we want to move countries. We were kids. There's a reason that's the K in that TCK exists. Shucks, I'm having a blackout. You know, the anagram. Is that an anagram? It's not an anagram. Anyways, the kid in TCK. We were kids. Hence, this specific landscape that exists for us inside. Nobody asked us if we wanted to move countries. Nobody asked us if we wanted to grow up with constantly changing environments. It was not a choice. So there is also a sense of helplessness involved in this entire story that doesn't get talked about. You know, I think a lot of us subconsciously deal with feelings of helplessness and anxiety without realizing it. The minute we find ourselves in social situations which require more work than many others.
I was just going to add, like, that's where survival mechanism plays in.
Bingo.
And I've had to, like, when I identified the word survival mechanism, when I heard it for the first time, it made so much sense. When, like, for a certain period of my life, I was in survival mechanism mode because I was constantly wondering what people would think, or, you know, because just to add on to that, for certain families like mine, where our job, like my parents' job was based, like that was the reason why we were in a certain country, we needed to show our best foot forward, because if we didn't, that could go up to who's bosses, that could affect my parents' career, that could, you know, et cetera, and snowball. And I'm sure other third culture kids, whether it's military or missionary or business, that played a role. That's why we had to be in the survival mechanism mode for a while, because it's like our whole world will fall apart if we don't play this role. Later on in life, realizing, oh, this was a role that I had to play. Who am I really? You know, aside from the whole like third culture kidness, it's like straight up saying like, who am I really? Aside from what I was told I should be.
Yeah. There's also, in some cases, I don't know how your experiences were, but I, for the longest time, dealt with a severe sense of betrayal from my parents, because when they moved to India, it's almost like I was on my own, because they fit in. For them, it was their quote-unquote home country, and they just presumed it was mine as well. And the experiences I was going through were completely not just bypassed, but additionally, it was like the person I'd become needed to be corrected. It's like I was some kind of mistake who spoke with an accent which was not appropriate, who had mannerisms which were not appropriate, who didn't have a radar for local cultural idiosyncrasies. It was like it felt like I was in a correctional facility.
Oh man.
And yeah, and that's another aspect which doesn't get talked about. I don't know how your experiences were in this case, but I know a lot of TCKs deal with this too, because their parents, if they move to what is home for them, they just blend in. And all of a sudden, when we were in Europe or in Libya, it was the three of us, all three of us were in it together. And then when they got to India, all of a sudden, I was on my own. They just blended in. And I was like, where the hell is everyone? I'm here on my own, help. And that is another aspect that needs to be talked about. So for parents raising third culture, acknowledge the differences in the experiences you and your children will go through.
Definitely. I think mine was a little different, partly because at least you were considerate enough to notice that. For me, it was like, my world is falling apart. Why don't you care? That was like the mindset I had coming to the Philippines. I didn't even think about how my parents felt, to be honest. Like it didn't even dawn on me until this very moment, that they were at home. But at the same time, because both of my parents came from different provinces in the Philippines, and Manila was actually pretty foreign to them. So I think they felt a certain aspect of also being a little bit foreign within their own country. So I'm not sure. That's actually a really good question I should ask. And because I think also there might have been distance between the friends that they knew prior, because they're coming back and they have all this experience now.
Yeah.
Like they have all this stories about Korea and how amazing it is, how it's so much more technologically savvy than it is in the Philippines. And so I think there might have been, this is me just assuming, in some of the conversations that they're having with their friends that they left behind, where they're like, they don't even fully understand anymore. Because I knew for a fact that my parents loved Korean culture too. Like they loved they loved experiencing new things, like things that they didn't have in the Philippines, like Four Seasons. They loved, because they also lived there for 6-7 years, just like I did. So that became home for them too. So I think there was an adjustment period. So this is just me kind of putting myself in their shoes and how they might have felt, because to this day, when my dad talks to his friends, he talks about Korea all the time, and we still eat Korean food at our house. So it's still very much a part of our lives.
Really? Did you, if I may ask, did you ever feel like you noticed your parents' code switching?
I'll be honest, I didn't really think much about my parents until the last couple of years. So that's a very interesting question. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think it depends on the setting they were in. So if they're at home, it's different, of course. But then if they're with all these dignitaries, totally different.
And of course, they're especially that adds a whole different dimension altogether. Yeah. Sorry. Of course. Yeah. My parents are doctors, so they were, or were. My dad passed recently, but they were both doctors. So it was also an intense environment, because hospitals, and their priority was to communicate with their patients to the best of their ability. So it was a very marked change I would notice in their behavior. But even when I'd see them with their families, with my extended families, because up until 9, it was just mostly the three of us, and we'd visit on vacation and meet family, but it was mostly the three of us. So we had a very tight dynamic. And then all of a sudden, when they got to India, that dispersed. And and this was not a great call my parents made, and they own it too, thankfully, which is pretty big of them. Since they were very busy with their careers and establishing themselves in a new environment, they left me with my aunt for the first few years. Not overnight, but she'd be taking care of me. She'd be babysitting me, for lack of a better term, even though I wasn't a baby. And first 5 years, I was basically banging the middle of her household, my aunt's household, which was a completely different world. It would be always very strange for me to notice how my parents' behavior would change depending on the environment they're in and when they engage with their family. It was like I was the only one who had any memory of the dynamic we shared as a family, just the three of us, for pretty much the first 9 years of my life. Does that make sense?
It does. And it's very interesting to even think about, because as we're talking, I've realized that there's so many different things that I haven't even considered being a third culture kid or noticed. And I feel like what we're talking about is just like the tip of the iceberg. This is what happens when, two mental health advocates come together and they ask
pretty much
the questions, like the deeper questions.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I want to respect your time as well. I noticed we're almost at 90 minutes now, and I think
oh my goodness, I didn't even notice. This is probably going to be the longest podcast episode we have. But yes, yeah, really? I totally forgot that.
That's on me. That's on me. I'm so used to recording long form podcasts, so my apologies if I added to.
No worries. I'm sure my third culture kid listener friends will enjoy this episode, because I feel like this really was just the tip of the iceberg. But before we end, is there any last words you would like to share with our audience? Any maybe tips or steps if they're in the midst of feeling like they're trying to figure out where they belong?
Oh, we could do a whole new episode on belonging. But I will repeat what I said, that nothing comes before showing up authentically in our environment on our own terms. Because no matter who it is we think we're trying to please, or whichever environment we're trying to fit in, we are worthless to society. If you're not being authentic. It might sound a little harsh, but that is my take on it. We are not in a position to serve society in any way if we haven't figured out our own connection to our own selves authentically. And that is, I think as third culture kids, we'll find ourselves in many situations where that attempt to be our authentic self will be threatened, but it's something we have to brave, not to sound dramatic, and just not allow to divert us from that. I almost said mission, but that sounds way too dramatic. But from that aspect, show up authentically, no matter what the consequences, and eventually the consequences will be in alignment to who you are meant to be.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, TL, for hopping on the podcast and sharing your thoughts with us. You are welcome anytime. I'm sure even in the aspect of music, that was something that I really would love to ask, because I'm sure some third culture kids, because I do have a friend who loves music and he channels his third culture kidness into what he does. And so I'm sure we'd love to hear that aspect and that side of you in the future. But thank you so much for coming on and giving your insight. We're so thankful you came on.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me on, Marie.
Gratitude from the bottom of my heart for listening to the very end. Please consider taking a minute to subscribe to our show so you know when the next episode is out. This is a labor of love, one I hope snowballs into one that's sustainable in its attempt to support independent thought and authentic relating. While having you as a regular member of our audience is what makes that a realistic prospect. Much love, and talk soon. Just another voice that is